Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. Before I start the episode, I just wanted to let all the coaches and athletes out there know about a special deal that we've got going with Elite Performance Journals. EPJ make both coaches' notepads ideal for developing session plans and for reviewing or reflecting on sessions. And for athletes looking for that extra edge, they also have an Elite Athlete Journal designed around specific needs of up-and-coming professional athletes. For any listeners of the Coach Doctor podcast, you can receive 20% off on any of their products by simply going to eliteperformancejournal.com, check out all of their products, and when you check out, use the code COACHDOCTOR, all one word and lowercase, for a special 20% discount. For schools and clubs, you can also get journals specific to your group's needs, with schools or clubs' logos, team values, and many other options to make it specific to you. Okay, now on to the episode. On this episode, I talked to Associate Professor Kate Pumpa. Kate is a lecturer and researcher in the fields of exercise physiology and sports nutrition at the University of Canberra. She is an accredited exercise physiologist and an advanced accredited sports dietitian. Kate completed her PhD at the Australian Institute of Sport in 2008 and has been working as a sports dietitian practitioner for almost 15 years. Like many of us in the sports industry, she began by volunteering as a sports dietitian for her local AFL club. Following this, she was given a role with Leinster Rugby Club in Dublin before returning home to work with Australia's most successful Super Rugby franchise, the ACT Brumbies. Kate is now a performance dietitian for the Australian Rugby Union, working across all teams from the Junior Wallabies to the Wallaroos and the Rugby Sevens. Kate's primary research interests include utilising technology to monitor energy expenditure during exercise, nutrition interventions to enhance performance, and physiological performance preparation and recovery. She is a Fellow of Exercise and Sports Science Australia, an Associate Editor for the Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport, and on the editorial board for the Journal of Nutrients. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Associate Professor Kate Pumpa. Today on the podcast, we've got Associate Professor Kate Pumpa from the University of Canberra. Thanks so much for joining us on the podcast, Kate. I really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Could you give us a quick, brief introduction to who you are and what you actually do?
Yes, as you mentioned, I'm an associate professor at the University of Canberra, and I work in the area of exercise physiology and sports nutrition. And that's one of the hats I wear. And the other one is I work as an accredited sports dietitian with a lot of high-level athletes, predominantly in rugby union and rugby sevens at the moment.
And how did you get into, sports nutrition?
I was completing my PhD at the Institute of Sport down here in Canberra a long time ago, and I had already gained my qualifications as an accredited practicing dietitian and just loved the sport aspect of it. And so I started off by completing a sports nutrition course, and then I volunteered a lot initially in some local AFL squads as their sports dietitian, until I finally got my first break in professional sport with Leinster Rugby back in 2008. And the rest is history. I've been working in rugby union since then.
Okay. So initially in those early days, if you started working in, that AFL you were working in probably was amateur or semi-professional, was that?
Yeah, semi-professional. So a lot of the players, it was one of the Canberra competitions. They are paid, but they also work full-time. But I guess with a lot of high performance and high level sport, you've got to start somewhere. And that was my first opportunity to sort of get a lot of hours, under my belt and a bit of experience in sport as a whole, and particularly team sport, which is where I've landed in terms of a lot of my teaching, my research and my practice, because I just love working with team sport athletes. So it's a really good start.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I think across the board, whether it be physios, strength and conditioning coaches or actual sports coaches, a lot of us sort of start off in that voluntary space, and I guess it's that entry point. And once we get in there and we develop a bit of experience in the sport, when we sort of slowly sort of move up in that world. So yeah, congratulations.
I think developing connections was probably one of the most important things that I got out of that volunteering experience, because the head coach of the club that I was working with, who now works with the Raiders, he was actually one of my references for my first professional job that I got, and he gave me a great reference, and that really helped me get that first professional job in sports nutrition. So I think for anyone listening in who's trying to get into elite sport, that volunteering and networking is one of the most important things you can do as an early career sort of sporting professional.
Yeah, awesome. And in that semi-professional environment, was there, I guess, much uptake of nutritional advice? Or
there was, because they'd never had a dietitian before.
Yep, okay.
So I was a jack of all trades back then, a lot of sports nutrition stuff, but also a lot of other assisting with game day. And I did a lot of cooking and baking of recovery foods and all sorts of things. So it was really well received. And I've actually still maintained some of the connections with the athletes that I worked with all those years ago.
Oh, that's awesome. Well done. So in terms of sports nutrition and then general population nutrition, is there a big difference? What are the main differences that you sort of come across?
There is. The underlying principles are the same for everybody in terms of making sure we all consume the right macro and micronutrients. The big difference for athletes is really the required amount of energy they need to consume. So a typical adult male might need to consume, say, 2,500 calories, for example. Now, a lot of the athletes I work with, if we look at some of the bigger athletes I work with, they're well in excess of 5,000 kilocalories per day, which means that the food that they require to consume is double that of an average adult male, because I predominantly work with male athletes. So I have been working with females the last few years. So the overall energy requirement is huge, but also the macronutrient breakdown is also quite different. So particularly with athletes who are trying to gain a lot of muscle mass, their protein requirements are higher than the general population as well.
Okay. So when you just mentioned 5,000 calories, or more, was it even more than that? I can't remember.
Yeah, over 5,000. For some of the big props I work with, we're looking at sort of over 5,000 to 5,500 kilocalories per day. So more than double.
What does that look like in a daily sort of meal plan? Is that?
It's a huge volume of food, and it's something that I would sit down with the athlete and we actually plan their meals out. So there's sort of a breakfast, then there's a mid-morning snack. There might be pre-training, post-training, lunch, afternoon snack, pre-training, post-training, then sort of a first dinner, then a second dinner, and then something before they go to bed as well. So there is just so many, they just have to eat fairly consistently. And something I do find with some of those athletes that need to eat those huge volumes of foods is they just struggle to eat the required volume. And also sometimes in some individuals, consuming food becomes a little bit unenjoyable. So we need to look at other strategies to boost up their calorie intake through meals so they don't have to eat a huge volume of food.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Is it, I mean, even for these big props that probably love their food, is it hard to, I'm thinking, it almost becomes like a job to keep your nutrition intake up?
It does. And one of the athletes I've worked with for a long time, actually, who I started off working with in the development program at Brumbies and has recently retired. It was a chore in terms of eating, because he was one of the athletes that just struggled to keep weight on. As soon as he started to run, it would just, he would lose weight so quickly. And so we were adding all sorts of things to smoothies and liquids to try and really boost up his energy intake, because he just didn't enjoy eating anymore because of the volume he had to consume, because it becomes a chore. And when you think about training, you don't want to be training on a huge full belly, and so you have to work around what they can tolerate as well, because it's no good putting loads of food in, then going out and doing a really hard conditioning session, then vomiting it all back up again, because then you kind of defeat the purpose. So there's a lot of strategies and factors we have to consider when trying to get that volume of food in as well, not just we got to get it in and you need to just train as per normal.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll ask some more questions around those specific things in a little while. But
Mhm.
I just wanted to go back to, you're also an accredited exercise physiologist, as well as a sports nutritionist. So do
Yes.
these areas go hand in hand? Does it, I guess, make it easier to be a sports nutritionist with the exercise physiology background and vice versa?
I think so. For me, it definitely does. And I teach exercise physiology at uni. That's the units that I teach and convene. But I think I just have that much better and deeper understanding of the physiology. And I feel like I can relate and also partake in a lot more of the conversations around rehabilitation a lot better, perhaps, than someone who has only had a pure nutrition background. So I have that deeper understanding of physiology, injury mechanisms, injury rehab and recovery and so forth, because I've studied it, but also worked in it for a long time. So I feel like it makes me a better sports dietitian. Not saying that you have to have that background to be a great sports dietitian, but I find personally it's a beautiful connection, those two things, because they go hand in hand really for athletes.
Yeah. Okay. I can see just behind you there's an ESSA. Is that an ESSA award behind you? That
Yes, I was made an fellow of ESSA last year. Yeah.
Oh, congratulations! Fantastic, awesome. Now, obviously, to become a professor or associate professor, you've got to complete a PhD.
Mhm.
What was your main area of research, or what did your PhD entail?
Yeah, my PhD encompassed the exercise physiology and nutrition. And I looked at a range of different complementary and alternative medicines as different methods for recovery after exercise-induced muscle damage. So DOMS, which everyone will have experienced at some point in their life, when you get that soreness in your muscles the day or two after you've done something that you're not used to, and it could be returning to the gym. It could be, gardening if you don't garden, any sort of unaccustomed activity, and it's that soreness that you get, and that it affects your range of motion as well as your perceptions of how well you feel and ready to train you feel. And so I was looking at a number of different strategies to try and reduce the experience of DOMS, to try and dampen that effect, to see if we could then return athletes to their performance or optimal performance quicker after some sort of unaccustomed exercise.
And what were your findings? Did you come up with any solutions?
There was a couple I found that reduced the perception of soreness. So, for example, I used a ginseng. It's a complementary medicine, ginseng, which is very popular amongst a lot of individuals. And also ginseng, and also topical arnica, which is another product that you can apply topically to the skin. I found that reduced the individuals that I studied, reduced their perception of soreness, which is great because then you feel better and able to train. But in terms of whether that then leads to subsequent damage because you're inhibiting some of those perhaps pain pathways, there is that potential it could do some more longer term damage. But in the short term, they were quite efficacious.
Okay, yeah, no, that sounds really, really interesting. I might read up on a bit more of your work. Just in going on that sort of same tangent, I've done some reading around the use of antioxidants to, I guess, improve recovery. And then there's also the argument against antioxidants, because sometimes we want our body to recover without that assistance. What's the feeling among that sort of argument?
There's two main theories behind that. There is some research to suggest that really high antioxidant consumption, particularly vitamin C and E, can actually lead to a maladaptation. So you might do all this resistance training, for example, in the effort of increasing your lean mass, but then taking huge volumes of vitamin C and E or other antioxidants then prevents that process of muscle protein synthesis actually occurring properly. So you end up with not adapting or not growing as you would like to, or recovering from that exercise intervention. There's been some more recent studies, though, that have sort of contradicted some of those earlier studies. So now we're a little bit up in the air in terms of where do we sit and what's the optimal dosage from an antioxidant perspective. In rugby lately, or the last couple of seasons, I've been using a product which is based on tart cherry juice, and it's a very high antioxidant anthocyanin content. And I've been using that as a form of recovery. And there is some really interesting research around that in terms of recovery and endurance-based athletes, and also with sleep, which is another avenue I've been exploring a little bit lately, is looking at nutritional interventions to enhance sleep. So I tend to steer clear from providing vitamin E, vitamin C, and things that we can get through foods quite easily. And I've actually gone down more of a sort of performance nutrition route, looking at these different types of products that do have antioxidants, but also have these anthocyanins, which seem to be efficacious for reducing that muscle soreness.
So something like tart cherry juice, where do you come across that? Is that something that's commonly found?
There's a couple of companies that do make it. There's one main company in Australia called Cherry Active that produces it. And then there's also a large company in the UK called Healthspan Elite, which you can also get it. So obviously I look for batch tested products. So I'm limited in terms of the types of companies that can actually get this particular product from, but they're the two that I would typically use because they're batch tested. So that means they've been screened for banned substances that athletes might return a positive doping test from. And so they're the two sources I get them from, because they're like carbohydrate gel shots. They're in small little packets, so I can pack them in the kit bags when the guys travel, and I find them quite beneficial.
Yeah, so this might sound like a really silly question, but tart cherry juice is completely different to stewed cherries in a bottle, and it's got that really dark juice that comes with it. Yep.
Yeah, they are different. Yeah, it's a different variety of cherry. It's a very specific variety of cherry. And also, I guess what will help you decipher between a tart cherry juice that has good research behind its benefits and a normal cherry juice is the price. Yeah. The tart cherry juice is very expensive.
Yeah, that's, again, some really interesting stuff there. And sorry, I'm just going again off track, but when you talked about its role with sleep, how does it improve sleep?
Yeah, so the tart cherry juice is a natural source of melatonin, and melatonin is really important when we're looking to help with the sleep process and help athletes or individuals fall asleep faster. And so tart cherry juice has a reasonable amount of scientific evidence to show that it's beneficial for helping individuals fall asleep faster and have a better quality of sleep as well as quantity. So I have been using this quite a lot the last couple of years, again, particularly when the athletes after games, when they might have be all ramped up in terms of not being able to sleep after competition, or if they have some sort of long haul travel where we need to, and they've got some perhaps not so favorable travel schedules, that we try and promote sleep through having cherry juice as well. And it seems to be a lot of the players love it, and it has the evidence to back it up. The only side effect seems to be a lot of the guys have been reporting some really strange dreams after they've been consuming this particular product. But then some of them have also found that they love these sort of really vivid dreams so much that they're becoming a bit of an addiction to cherry juice because they just want it to have those particular dreams. It hasn't been with every athlete. That's been enough that I've sort of made a mental note to say to people now, if I'm giving it to them, well, you may experience some different dreams.
I'm going to have to try and get my hands on some and try it. It sounds
a lot of staff have tried it out.
Yeah, okay.
And the teams I work with, yeah.
So, Kate, I've noticed from you've got a really large range of publications that you've done and a very broad range of research areas, from the effects of exercise on cancer and, I guess, cognitive issues to body composition, energy expenditure in elite football and rugby. Do you continue to research such a broad range of nutrition, or have you started to really focus on one specific area?
I've started to refine my research a little bit. I guess initially when I came into academia as an early career researcher, one of the key things that you need to attain to progress up the ranks at a university is grant income. And there's really limited funding in sports-specific projects, really isolated sports. So I digressed a little bit into a bit of health-based research, which I really enjoyed. And I had some really great studies and out of those earlier careers. But I've really started to now focus a lot more on nutritional interventions to enhance performance. If they have a slight health angle as well, that's often advantageous when I'm trying to gain some funding to set up particular projects, because running big projects are quite expensive. And so my area now is sort of digressed a little bit, or more focusing into around team sport athletes, energy availability, body composition and sleep. They're sort of the main ones I'm focusing on at the moment. And I have a few studies in that area going. And I also have a lot of PhD students, and they undertake a lot of research, which also helps broaden my scope a little bit. And there's some of the publications I have. And a lot of them are in the area of sports science, but I still do have a couple of students who are more within the health area, but I can contribute to their PhDs from my sort of both physiology as well as nutrition expertise to contribute knowledge to their health-based research.
Okay, great. So going back now to your role in sport, your first role, as you mentioned earlier on, was with, or your first full-time professional role, I guess.
Yep.
That was with Leinster Rugby over in Ireland.
It was.
Was rugby already an interest for you, or how did that role come about?
It was a very opportunistic role that I took. I had finished my PhD. I'd moved into academia. I'd been in academia for 12 months and I decided that wasn't really for me. And this job came up over in Ireland at Leinster Rugby. And so I applied for it. And Michael Checker was back in Australia. He was the head coach at that particular time. So I met with him. We had a coffee, talked about what he was looking for and his philosophy within and thoughts around nutrition in the club. I provided sort of my thoughts and ideals and values around nutrition in the club. And then not long after, I was on a plane moving to Ireland. So we had a similar values in terms of what we wanted to get out of the athletes from a nutrition perspective. And so, he gave me my first break in terms of nutrition. And I do remember that coffee very vividly with him. And my experience was in AFL to that point, and he's like, well, why would I give you the job? And I was like, well, someone's got to give an opportunity to get into breakthrough into that professional sport, and he gave me that opportunity. So I am very grateful for him to give me that first, take a chance on me, I guess, and
so you're not
catapult me into the world of professional sport.
You're not going to take off and join the Pumas over in Argentina?
No, I'm not. I actually know the dietitian of the Pumas, and she's great. So no.
Okay, good. So after that, a few years later, you returned and you came back to Australia and you started working with the Brumbies.
I have, yes.
Find much variation in nutrition between, I guess, the cultures, like, the traditional Irish staple of potatoes and, what we have here, or the general nutritional beliefs from the playing groups?
The general nutritional strategies and beliefs are quite similar. One of the post-training foods that I used to use was mashed potato and post-games, because they tended to like that. And, it makes sense in terms of good carbohydrate. We could put some really good salt and things in there to help with electrolyte replacement. It's really palatable after a game of rugby because it's soft and smooth and it digests quite well. Whereas you don't tend to have those on the menu over here. The main challenge I found working in that European context compared to the Australian context is the amount of travel that you do into different countries, and then the types of foods that are available in different countries, and also the language barriers. So here I have, New Zealand is really easy. We had South America, Japan, where, sometimes we had a few things lost in translation, and South Africa. But I found that, 1 week we might be in France. And so then I have to work out, and my interpretation of a low fat, or trying to explain to them what I'm wanting from a performance nutrition perspective, when a lot of their foods are very reliant on cream and butter and really high fat foods. Those sorts of, my perception of low fat is definitely not their perception of low fat and the types of fats. And then, the next week we would be in Italy. And so then we'd have the same different cuisines, some language barriers sometimes. And I guess that's one thing I became very grateful for, is Czech also speaks multiple languages. So he was able to help me with some of those particular countries where there was a lot of issues. Well, not issues, but some things were lost in translation. So to rectify them before we got there, that was the main thing. There's just so many different cuisines when you play in a European rugby in very short successions. So with our Super 15s, when it used to be, we'd go to South Africa, but we'd go there for quite a number of weeks. And so you can kind of nut things out as you go, whereas it'd be in Europe, France, then Italy, then we'd be in the UK, and then back at home, and then off to somewhere else. So very diverse.
Okay. And just again, you said that Czech was quite supportive and quite, your ideas aligned really, really well. Have you been in any environments or teams where coach hasn't really put much emphasis on nutrition, and you've sort of had to find your feet in that role?
Yeah, definitely. So every coach, I guess, has a different interpretation of how they see nutrition fitting into their high performance program. Some people have a really big focus on it in terms of being incorporated, ingrained into those athletes, part of their everyday training regime. And, ensuring that they're ticking all their nutrition boxes. And, I'm contacted as soon as there is an injury to make sure we get on top of their nutrition as well as the physio and all the other rehabilitation aspects. And then there have been some other coaches that it's taken a lot of time, hard work, education for them to really understand of how nutrition can be really important and play a role. And it's not just a matter of an athlete hopping on the scales and they're a particular weight this day. And the coach might think, oh, well, they just need to lose weight, or they might have, or they need to gain weight, for example. Whereas it's not, I guess, individuals, athletes, body composition is not as simple as just hopping on a scale. And so from my perspective, and I feel like I really got that, I've achieved that at Brumbies over the last couple of years, getting the coaches on board to understand the difference between the weight on a scale and body composition, so lean mass versus fat mass, and looking more holistically at what an athlete is made up of rather than just the weight on the scale. And so yes, I guess it depends on the coach, how long they've been around, how long since they've played as well, because often coaches bring in their perceptions of what was appropriate when they were playing as well. But I do find it's improved in the last 15 years. It has improved massively in terms of the receptiveness and the importance of implementing a dietitian in the team as part of that high performance unit.
When you're with the Brumbies, or when you're with the Wallabies or the Australian Sevens,
Mm-hmm.
do you travel with the team in all cases, or do you implement a strategy and then they just utilise that while they're away?
Not all cases. In Europe, I tended to travel a little bit more. Perhaps there's just slightly more funding in European rugby when I was there, particularly to enable travel with the team. And I know in some of the Irish sports dietitian, for example, she travels with the team everywhere, whereas that's never occurred in Australian rugby. We've never had a full-time dietitian traveling with the team, predominantly due to funding issues. What I have set up, I travel occasionally, but rarely now that I have set up my procedures and processes. So I do a lot of the legwork before the team even touches down in terms of preparing what food they'll be eating at the hotels in conjunction with our strength and conditioning or athletic performance staff. We work out the timing of meals, what's going to be at those meals, or they work out the timing and the training. I work out what meals are going to be suitable around that training. We look at pre-game meals, post-game meals. I pack up our nutrition travel box before the team departs, so they have all their nutritional supplement requirements before they take off. So a lot of the stuff I prepare and do, and the players go and do their thing. And if there's someone who there's any issues while I'm on their away, I'm just a phone call away, and I can usually sort them out. And there's always a number of players who don't travel, so I spend more time with them. Yeah,
okay. It sounds like a pretty big logistical effort to get everything sorted. And do you liaise with the accommodation prior and say these are your chefs to make, or how does that work?
Yeah, so other than the sort of face-to-face hands-on stuff with the athletes, there's a lot of admin that goes with nutrition. So the process, and this has been the same with most of the teams I work with because this works most efficiently, the team manager will be in contact with the hotel where we're staying, and I'm copied in. There'll be an introduction to me as the dietitian. I provide the hotel with our catering requirements, and so I have a document that outlines what sort of things I want the hotel to develop for our athletes, the types of foods, what not to be including as well. So really high fat foods, obviously, if we're training. I don't like to have any seafood on game day or the evening before. There's a perceived higher risk of food poisoning with seafood. So I sort of have that as a prerequisite. So once the hotel has my catering menus, usually the chef and I will correspond directly. We will work out a menu because I like for chefs to be able to cook to their strengths as well. So I don't dictate a menu. I say, this is what I'm after. Cook, what can you do within your area of expertise and your strengths? They come back with the menu. I'll then sort of make any comments or changes. We will agree on what's going to be provided. We then copy back in the team manager and also usually the athletics performance director who travels with the team. This is what's been agreed, and this is what we're rolling with. And so that's that process. And then if there are any issues, I usually, depending on who's in charge and the teams that I've worked with, but if it's the athletic performance director, The one I've been working with recently, for example, when he gets to the hotel, he meets with the chef just to review, to make sure this is everything that's going to be happening while they're there, just to make sure it's all nice and smooth. So a bit of back and forth, and that's more back and forth when we're traveling to non-English speaking countries where I don't speak the language. There's sometimes a few quirky things that appear that didn't think were going to appear.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Now, look, I guess from my perspective, being employed as a full-time member of staff at a university, and obviously that's one of your roles as well. I'm trying to get around my head how you can fit in doing that with, as well as all this stuff that you're doing with rugby. It's mind-boggling. Do you get any time to yourself?
Not a lot, because I also have two small kids, but I do have a really nice arrangement at the moment where the Brumbies actually pay the university for my time. So I'm seconded to the Brumbies for my time there, and I utilise the funding from that particular arrangement to, say, buy out some of my repeat tutorials, and it also helps with professional development and so forth. The Rugby Australia stuff is on top of that, so that is a lot of extra work. But that comes in ebbs and flows as well, because with the sevens, it's fairly consistent. But with, say, the Wallaroos, for example, they have an on season, and then they're all back at their super clubs. With the Junior Wallabies, sort of we're done for the year now. So they have a more intense session from, say, end of Feb, March through till June, July, and then they're done. So I will have little pockets where it's really, really busy, and then I might not see those particular athletes for a while again.
Yeah, okay. No, you're doing very well. I'm sort of a bit in awe of how you manage to fit everything. I'm struggling to do a couple of podcasts in between work. So
it is challenging. Being super organised.
Yeah. Well, you're obviously a bit more organised than me. Hey, Kate, you had a little stint in basketball. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah. I've worked with basketball for a few years, actually. Again, the university that I currently work at they own a basketball team, the Canberra Capitals, which is they play in the Women's Basketball League, WNBL. I've worked with them for a long time, and it's a very short, intense period of work because they're only here for really November through to Feb. But I've also worked at the Centre of Excellence over at the AIS with the development basketball players, and that has been a real challenge and eye-opener. Going from rugby into development athletes who are very different in terms of physique and the style of game and their requirements, required a lot of upskilling. And also, I guess, with any sport, there was a lot of upskilling for me transitioning from nutrition requirements from 15s to 7s, for example. But basketball was a whole nother kettle of fish because, even though some of our forwards are really tall and robust, like some of these basketballs, boys particularly, well, they are boys, so younger development athletes, they're just so huge that not only are we looking at energy requirements for their training, but also they're still growing. So that adds a whole nother layer of complexity on top of it.
Yeah, so I was going to ask about that, the going from that rugby union background to the basketball, and I'm imagining, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the basketballers tend to be very tall and probably a little bit leaner. Whereas, especially compared to your front rowers and some of those sorts of positions in rugby, where there's a much more of a focus on, developing hypertrophy and a lot more muscle mass on the rugby players.
Yeah, so obviously the forwards in rugby, you don't see anyone of that sort of physique in basketball. So they're if you had to pick polar opposites, that would be it. The basketballers, because it is a very anaerobic, even though it's an aerobic sport, like it goes for, a long duration, it's still really anaerobic. They might be playing 5 minutes and off, and then they're back on for another few minutes and off. So it's a different nutritional strategy in terms of performance, but also just their nutritional requirements, particularly with the younger basketball players I've worked with. They coming usually straight from home. If they're living in like the residential facilities at AIS, they may not have had to cook or to learn nutrition because they've eaten whatever their parents have provided for them. And yes, they get their meals and foods provided to them at AIS, but it's educating them about how much they need to be eating, when they need to be eating, not just eating breakfast, lunch, dinner, and making sure they take appropriate food to school and remember to make their lunch orders and all those sorts of things. But just from a physique perspective, the last season I worked with the development players, there was one young boy, he was only 16 and he was 220 centimeters tall. Like, he was just ginormous in terms of, he's the tallest athlete I've ever worked with, and he was only 16. So he's still got a bit of growing to go. But then again, so lanky because, you know, he's shot up, but, you know, he hasn't got that muscle mass yet to support that huge frame that he has.
Yeah, wow. Again, going back to now looking at rugby, you've started working with the Wallaroos and the Australian Women's Sevens, as well as traditionally spent more time in men's 15s. What about across different genders? Is there much difference in nutritional requirements for males versus females?
Yeah, there is. And particularly around iron, metabolism iron deficiency, that's way more prevalent in the female athletes I've worked with in basketball, as well as in rugby sevens and 15s. And so that's something that I'm always really aware of in terms of really high training loads, and making sure that athletes are consuming enough iron, the female athletes, because they lose so much more iron than males do. Just not only are they losing it through contact and sweat and feces, but also through menstruation. And they just, a lot of female athletes tend to have some level of iron deficiency. So it's about educating those athletes how to stay on top of and make sure they consume enough iron through food, and catching, if they do end up iron deficiency, catching it early so that we can actually rectify it, because that significantly impacts performance by dropping off aerobic capacity. I also have found previously, I guess maybe prior to 3 or 4 years ago, I also found undereating was a little bit more prevalent in the female athletes that I worked with. So there was perhaps more of a focus on the aesthetic aspect of their sport, particularly in sports where they needed to wear really tight-fitting clothes, for example, in basketball where they wear their bodysuits. And so there would be a tendency for female athletes to undereat, which can put them into a state of low energy availability. So where they're not consuming enough food to not only tick off all their basic metabolic processes, but also to meet the demands of training, recovery, repair, and so forth, which can then result in what's called relative energy deficiency in sport. Over the last couple of years, I've really seen a shift, and I've been identifying it a lot more in male athletes that I'm working with. Whereas if I look back 15 years ago, and perhaps, well, I guess in hindsight, I look back 15 years ago and now I suspect there probably was a couple of the athletes that I was working with were probably undereating, not overeating, in terms of trying to shift their body composition. But we just didn't have the knowledge in that area 15 years ago. Whereas now we have the science behind low energy availability and energy deficiency in sport. I'm picking it up a lot more in females as well as males, which is really interesting. I guess it's definitely not a great thing to be occurring in sport, because it's usually aesthetic driven. But sort of that's one of the things, it was predominantly female, but now seems to be across both sectors.
Yeah, I was going to ask that in terms of, like, you know, with this big increase in Instagram and you get like a lot of, I presume, a lot more of the female athletes, you know, in their swimwear and stuff like that. And I guess you're starting to see that now with the males as well, like a lot of Instagram posts. Is it almost become a bit of a battle to try and make sure they're eating enough to still achieve their first goals, which is performance, before worrying about the aesthetic side of things? Yeah,
it's becoming a real problem in sport, I think, across both genders. And I really I've spent a lot of time really trying to educate the guys that I'm working with and the women that I'm working with at the moment to make sure that they are not undereating, and taking it from the perspective of performance. So really looking at their performance metrics and their performance outcomes. We always do a lot of testing around athletes at the start of season, maybe during post-season, to see where they're at, and looking at body composition as one aspect of that. So if they are perhaps carrying what we would say is a little more fat mass, but their VO2 is really high, like their 1.2 time is really good, they're lifting PBs, why do we need to change that aspect of them? Is it going to make them, you know, a better athlete if they're also playing really well? So I've been spending a lot more time educating the athletes about trying to improve performance and be able to train as hard as they can train in every single session by fueling, like eating enough food before that session, so they can train hard and get better adaptations to improve that performance, rather than let's go into a session not having fueled properly and then struggle through the session. And yeah, you may be in a little bit of energy deficit, but you didn't work as hard, so you're not going to get those adaptations. And so it's been a big education process. And I've been, over the last couple of years at Brumbies, spent a lot of time with the coaching staff as well as the athletic performance staff to really try and reinforce that message of, we're eating to perform. We're not eating to look a certain way. And, if they're eating to perform and they're lifting better, they're training better, often those body composition or desired body composition traits will then show themselves because they're able to train harder and get those better adaptations.
You've been working with 15s and 7s, and we've sort of touched upon this briefly. What's the main differences between fueling a 15-a-side rugby player that plays an 80-minute game, especially you've got quite a big variation in body types from front rowers to drum halves to wingers and fullbacks, compared to a 7s side that play 14-minute games, have a period of 2 to 3 hours in between their next game. What's the difference in that sort of nutrition intake look like for those groups?
On a competition day, it's quite different, because if I'm looking at 15s, we would have a pre-game meal maybe 3 to 4 hours prior to have a decent sized meal, and then they might just top up some carbohydrates, maybe 60 minutes, 90 minutes out with some really simple things like bananas or a light sandwich or muesli bar or something really small and easy. Whereas with 7s, you don't have the ability to have a pre-game meal every game. So it's about setting the athlete up well in the morning, making sure they're having a really good breakfast in 7s, and then making sure we have appropriate nutritional recovery strategies in place between games. So there's not really the opportunity to sit down and have a big meal, or when there is that opportunity, a lot of the athletes choose not to take that opportunity because they don't want to be running around with a lot of stuff in their tummy. So that's where I use a lot of smoothies and liquid meal based supplements, to smaller sort of foods ingested quite frequently to help regain their glycogen stores, because it is so, there 14 minutes, it's an aerobic based sport, but it has a really high anaerobic capacity. So they need to have a good stocks of carbohydrate or glycogen within the muscle so that they can do those repeat sprints for that really short duration. Whereas in 15s, we have that, pre-game meal, and then generally they're not going to consume anything at halftime. They might have sports gels or something and some sports drink, but then nothing until post-game. So the strategies in terms of game day are quite different. Something that I've learned from 7s this year, working with the women's 7s with Tom Carter, is just the volume of work those girls do is huge. And I feel like in terms of their running volumes, there's so much more than I've ever seen with 15s players, that their loading is quite enormous. It obviously works really well for them because they do so well, but their nutrition, particularly the women, we really need to focus on getting a lot of food into them as well, because their training loads are so high. So they need to not only be able to fuel all those sessions and that high running volume, but they also need to be able to recover and then back it up so they can still have a good gym session day after day.
So would their, I guess, nutrition look different during, you talked about the game day prep and I guess the recovery between games for 7s. How about during those periods of training where they might not have a tournament for 2 weeks time, and all the boys gather together and they don't have a test match for 2 weeks time? Does the nutrition look more similar at that stage, or again is it
when they're in their home, like when we're training, the 7s are training back at RA at the headquarters, then they have I guess it's easier for them to have more control over the food that they bring into the club. We have a smoothie station set up there, and they get some lunches and those sorts of things. We do provide some food, and also some nutritional supplements that help boost that calorie intake when they might not, if they're going from a gym session into a field session or a field into gym, with limited time in between. So we try and sneak a few extra calories in there. But in terms of their day-to-day, it's just looking at opportunities to eat regularly throughout the day and make sure they get the volume of food in. So it often is breakfast at home, breakfast when you get to headquarters. Then you go into your session, you have your snack, you have your lunch. Then before you leave, have your first dinner, then you have your second dinner when you get home, then you have something else before you go to bed. So it's just sort of, I guess, being a little bit more strategic when they are at home, and they can control a lot of the nutritional intake that they have. Whereas when they go on tournament, then we're sort of, again, we're looking at hotel-based food and relying on the support staff that travel with them to have appropriate foods around and direct the players to getting good sources of food when they're traveling.
Yeah, okay. And do guys like Tom Carter or Tim Walsh, do they sort of police it, or do we just give the girls in that sevens team or the players in the Wallabies or whoever it might be, do we just give them like trust that these are the expectations, you need to try and make sure you're meeting them, or is there a little bit more overseeing that it's actually being performed?
No, the coaches oversee the programs, particularly when the dietitian doesn't travel, but particularly in the sevens, there is a lot of trust in that. It's one of the best teams that I've worked with in terms of the environment. There is a lot of trust between the coaches and the players. The expectations of the players are really clear. There's a lot of nutritional advice and education that goes into those players. And yes, a lot of them are really young, so they've got a lot of learning, and they will evolve over time in terms of identifying what works really well for them. But there is that trust. They hope and encourage the girls to seek out those good food options when they're traveling. And they're not the police by any means, a food police. But if they feel someone's really deviating off track, I'm sure they get a little nudge to get back on track and to come and chat with me when they get back to Australia.
Yeah, okay. So you mentioned supplements a couple of times. Are there any you recommend, or are there any supplements that you suggest are important, and supplements that you think are a bit of a waste of time?
Yeah, so there are ones that I would more commonly use than others. And so things that I would routinely use are things like whey protein, like a whey protein isolate or a WPI, has really good evidence for muscle protein synthesis or muscle growth. So it's something that I use quite regularly. And also a liquid meal supplement that sort of has a carbohydrate protein composition with a lot of other amino acids or vitamins and minerals in it, when I'm looking to try and get a much higher, a lot of calories into an athlete in a very small volume. So you can buy really high, like mass gainers, for example, really high calorie, very small volume. So we can get a lot of energy into those particular athletes without having something really heavy sitting in their tummy, because you can usually add 250, 300 mils of water or milk and you're good to go. So they're probably two key ones that I'd use. But then I use other sorts of nutritional supplements depending on the individual athlete at the time in the season and what's going on with them. So common ones I might use include creatine in a pre-season, or if someone's injured, if I'm trying to either help with muscle hypertrophy, or also if I'm trying to help an athlete minimize atrophy if they have sustained an injury. So there is some research around the use of creatine trying to minimize muscle atrophy if you're immobilizing a limb, for example, if you've done an ACL. I use fish oils quite a bit, particularly in those who don't consume any fish, because they're really high in omega-3s. It has great anti-inflammatory properties. And I also find that it can be very advantageous for those athletes who have a long history of anti-inflammatory use. And it's a much kinder alternative to their tummies. And so I've had a couple of more senior athletes this year at Brumbies who've managed to get themselves off, regular anti-inflammatory use by having a better routine of fish oil consumption. Because there's great evidence for fish oils, and not only in, more often, a lot of the research in that area is in older populations with arthritis and joint problems. And we've sort of taken some of that literature and knowledge and applied it into a sport context, which appears to work really well with some athletes. That's something else that I also use if someone is injured and they're going to be out for a long period of time, as a strategy to minimize the amount of muscle mass they'll lose. And then there's also those more specialized supplements that we do dabble in terms of like collagen if someone's injured. That is a nutritional supplement we use if someone has damage or injuries to their ligaments or tendons, for example. And then there's a range of other vitamins and minerals. If I have an athlete who's iron deficient, then there's usually a iron deficiency, a protocol that I apply with iron supplementation. I use probiotics a lot during high periods of training or through winter. Great evidence for the use of probiotics to minimize risk of illness, and also gastrointestinal upset. So used to use that a lot when we were all traveling internationally. Petered back a little bit, but over the last couple of years, but I've really got back into that this year, particularly with the Brumbies and also the Sevens, because there's such good evidence for use in terms of enhancing their immune function. And I've done some research in that area as well that really supports the use of those in rugby particularly.
In terms of carbohydrates from a sports performance perspective, carbohydrates would be considered the ultimate for sports performance. Yep. Would you tend to agree with that?
Yeah, so I guess that's something else I use a lot of is sports gels and sports drink, particularly during games, really only during games, or in summer when it's really hot, we use sports drinks and also slushies, like sports drink slushies, to not only cool the athlete down, but also to give them that extra carbohydrate, because carbohydrate is broken down so easily by the body and converted into energy and fuel for that particular athlete. So it's really a primary fuel source for exercise. So it is a really important macronutrient in terms of energy output. But I guess where some people have a downfall is they perhaps overconsume the carbohydrates. And I think that's really why carbohydrates have had a bad rap over the years. It's just that individuals haven't, what I would say, periodized their nutrition appropriately by managing the portion sizes of carbohydrates they consume on different days of the week.
What sort of carbohydrates do you suggest are the best for athletes, maybe pre and post games?
Yeah. So if it depends on the individual. If someone is trying to put on weight or really struggles to maintain weight, I get them eating a lot more high glycemic index carbohydrates because they break down a lot faster. So they're out of their tummy and being digested. So then the athlete can eat again sooner without feeling sick. So I do use that quite a lot. But also the more lower glycemic index carbohydrates, I encourage most of the athletes really to consume those in our everyday training. In their breakfast, their lunch, dinner, we have carbohydrates during snacks and really nutritious ones like fruits. We have a really good fruit set up at Brumbies, a lot of dairy-based products that have carbohydrates in them, like a little sandwich bar that enables them to get carbohydrates in some of the athletes who have really high energy requirements. So I'm talking that 5,000 plus. I sometimes substitute in maybe some jelly snakes and lollies and those sorts of things just to give them some really small, easily digested carbohydrates to get a few extra couple of 100 calories into them. And they're usually pretty happy to be doing that. We use juices a bit, liquid carbohydrates, again, particularly during really heavy periods of training where I'm trying to get volume of carbs in, but not necessarily sitting in the stomach like a lower glycemic index carbohydrate would. So in terms of the type, depends on the athlete, but there always needs to be some carbohydrate going in before the session and some going in after that session, depending on the athlete's goals and to how much they're putting in. There's always something.
Yeah, okay. And carb loading, that was a really big thing back, when I was sort of a teenager and sort of in my early 20s when I was playing. The idea was to have a big meal of carbs the night before your game, and you'd sleep on a full stomach of carbs, and that would hopefully get you through the game the next day. What are the main things to consider now? I know that research has sort of improved a lot on this area.
Yeah, I really don't advocate carb loading in rugby players. If they were running a marathon, absolutely, because you're going to be running for a few hours. In reality, if they're playing a full game, we're getting 80 minutes plus warm up. So what I get the athletes to do is to have a bit more focus on carbohydrates the day before a game. So we're looking sort of 24 to 48 hours out from kickoff, or 24, 36 hours. So to include a bit more carbohydrate in their breakfast, lunch and evening meal the day before game, and make sure there's some good carbohydrates at breakfast and lunch if they're having an evening kickoff. So I get them to periodize it. So they up their carbohydrate intake a little bit. We definitely don't load. So they're not sort of minimizing all the other food and just sometimes carb loading, just putting lots of really sugary based high glycemic index carbohydrates in to build up muscle glycogen stores. So we would encourage more carbohydrate strategically, maybe topping up with sports drinks and things, and then definitely getting some in after. I provide everyone with chocolate milks after games because it gives me good carbohydrate, good protein. Most people are very happy to down that. And then backing it up with a good meal later. And then as we go back in through our sort of weekly training cycle, we then manipulate the carbohydrate intake again. We sometimes drop it on rest. We drop it on rest days or lighter training days. We beef it up again on those heavy training days. But carb loading in rugby, not so much anymore.
Are all proteins created equally? Like you've got these days, you go into a supplement store, you've got your plant protein or your vegan proteins, and then you've got your other, I guess, animal-based, like from eggs or milk or something like that. You've got those proteins as well. Who's the big winner in the protein?
If your focus is muscle protein synthesis, which a lot of athletes are trying to gain lean muscle mass, you really need to be looking at a whey-based protein is going to give you the best bang for your buck. It contains the essential amino acids and has a really high leucine content. And leucine is that key amino acid that drives that whole muscle protein synthesis cascade. There are a lot of good plant-based proteins out there. Soy is probably the best option if you are not consuming any animal-based foods. But if you're looking at the research in terms of where you get the most effect, it does tend to be with the animal-based sources, and whey comes from an animal-based source. Just because it does, all the animal-based products contain those essential amino acids, typically tend to be higher in leucine. Whereas your plant-based proteins, other than soy, you need to eat lots of different plant-based foods to make sure you get all the essential amino acids in that meal. So you need to combine different foods. So you might be eating some wheat, but also need to have some lentils, or you need to be having different plant foods in conjunction with each other to sort of pull all those amino acids together to help with growth, but also make sure that the leucine content is quite high. So they're not all created equal. You can do it on a vegetarian or vegan-based diet. You just have to be way more diligent if your goal is trying to increase muscle mass. So and you don't eat animal-based foods.
Yeah. Have you had any athletes that you've been involved with that are vegan or vegetarian? Has that been?
I have, yes. Vegetarian is really quite easy, I find, in terms of making sure they get their protein requirements in, easily managed. Vegan becomes a little bit more challenging. I did have a couple of athletes a few years ago after the Game Changer came out, decided that was a good way to go. And I'm really open to, if an athlete wants to try something, I'm happy to support them. And what I do is I spend a lot of time creating appropriate meal plans and going through with them what they need to do to actually get their nutritional requirements in. What I tend to find is then a lot of athletes struggle with either the volume of food that they need to eat to get the required protein from plant-based sources and the energy that they need from plant-based sources. And then they work it out themselves, whether it's really sustainable and achievable for them and their current lifestyle. Because I think in that particular show, what a lot of athletes didn't realize was these particular athletes in the show had cooks and chefs and things preparing all their meals and doing all their organization and all that sort of things. Whereas in reality, most athletes don't have a chef at home preparing all their meals and doing all their shopping and cooking, and it becomes a little more challenging. So, and what I did find with one particular athlete trying to stick to this particular way of eating, they lost so much weight. It was not sustainable for them to play in the position that they were in and be as light as they were. So they had to make changes. And in the end, they came to their own self-realization that they just couldn't feasibly eat enough food to keep them at a reasonable weight competitive for rugby.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned soy before. Now, again, soy, sometimes there's links between soy and like increased like estrogen effects.
Yeah.
Is that an issue or not?
No, it's a lot of that research is sort of unfounded, really. And in a athletic population, like I wouldn't be, like everything, don't just eat soy, for every meal of every day, everything in moderation. But yeah, it's a decent alternative if you don't eat animal-based products. Yeah, or even if you do eat animal-based products, there's a different plant-based alternative, because there's also the whole sustainability issue of consuming animal-based versus plant-based protein as well, which I think is a really valid argument for wanting to try and consume more plant-based proteins and plant-based food over animal-based proteins and food.
In terms of the absorption, I've tried some of the vegan protein powders, and I find them a little bit more gritty and stuff. Does your body absorb them as well?
You do absorb them as well, but I have had a lot of athletes with exactly the same feedback. Either the palatability tends to be the problem with a lot of the plant-based proteins.
Yeah. Okay.
And a few years ago, there was some literature published in regards to the lead content in a lot of these plant-based proteins as well. In all the batch tested, I would only use batch tested products, and it wasn't really an issue in Australia, but it was an issue in some overseas organizations where their plant-based proteins tended to contain a lot of other nasty little things in them.
Yeah, is that from like like glyphosate and stuff where they're spraying like chemicals?
Yeah, and also the soil that they're grown in and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, no, that's interesting. So if you had, like, for just an amateur coach, if you had 3 points to sort of help them that they could try and implement, they don't have a full-time nutritionist, they're not full-time athletes, what would 3 key points from you be?
Yeah, I guess the first one, maybe this is a first clustering points, is Sports Dietitians Australia has developed a coaches toolbox, which has a lot of great resources for coaches for that exact situation where you don't have a dietitian working with the club, and there's heaps of really useful information within that website. So you can just go to the Sports Dietitians Australia website and click on the coaches toolbox, heaps of great resources. So if the coach is really wanting to upskill and provide and help athletes, they can give a lot of really good information. The other things, I guess I would look at would be for a coach to be encouraging athletes to eat for performance, and to making sure that they're eating appropriate foods throughout the week, and manipulating that food. They don't need to eat the same volume of food on a rest day than they do on a training day, but really encouraging performance, eating for performance rather than eating for a body composition or to look a certain way, because a lot of the athletes look up to the coaches and they're seeing them as the example. And so just the wording around food and performance can even be quite powerful. If you're working with female athletes, something to consider is, if an athlete is starting to struggle, if their aerobic capacity is dropping off, maybe it is worthwhile, and you're noticing that the performance indicators are dropping off, referring them off to the sports physician or their GP or someone to get some of their biochemistry assessed, like iron status, to see whether it's something to do with their iron, if they are iron deficient, for example. So it might not be a consequence of high training load. It could be that they've just had they might have iron deficiency. So good medical screening processes in place for those micronutrient deficiencies are really important. And then I guess one other key tip would be, don't underestimate the role of nutrition in an injured athlete. So if you do have an injured athlete, just leaving them to their own devices sometimes is not the best avenue, but still encouraging them to have good nutritional consumption, reducing perhaps portion sizes or seeking out some expert nutrition advice can then leave them in a much better place when they are returning to play. Because if they sort of are left to their own devices and they can't train and play, a lot of athletes may tend to put on a lot of fat mass, for example, which can exacerbate the injury, make it longer to get them back to play. So I think encouraging healthy or good nutritional interventions when injured is just as important for that performance as well.
Yeah, okay. No, I know that one from on a personal level. When I sort of finished up playing, it probably wasn't like during an injury situation. I think I kept eating the same amount of calories or kilojoules as I'd been as I was playing, participating in sport. And I all of a sudden I went from training, 4 or 5 days a week to nothing. And I saw a really quick, increase in my fat mass. So it's common. It's just about educating the athletes to how to periodize their nutrition around training and so forth. Yeah, awesome. Okay, I realize I've taken up about an hour of your time, and you've probably got lots of other things to be doing at the moment, and you're probably really, really busy. So I just want to say I really appreciate your time. I think we've got some absolutely brilliant tips from you around nutrition and how coaches at all levels could potentially utilize nutrition a little bit better in terms of their athletes' performance, and even for athletes as well that might want to listen to the podcast, and some tips for them as well to try and potentially improve performance. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. I hope everyone, and you've learned a few little things about the importance of nutrition in sport.
No, I'm sure they have, and all the best to you, and with both your academic, your research career, and with Australian rugby as well.
Great. Thanks very much, James.
Thanks, Kate. Wow, I could have spoken to Kate for another hour or so, and we've already discussed a follow-up interview. The thing I really enjoyed about this is the strategies we as coaches can put in place to potentially enhance performance through diet at all levels of sport. The one thing I wanted to do on this podcast was provide development opportunities for coaches at all levels, and I really believe that this conversation does just that. As a community coach, some simple strategies around pre and post-game nutrition, or at that elite level when you may have taken the role of diet in performance for granted. Another standout point for me was the battle we have with maintaining a performance diet with the added pressure of athlete aesthetics in the current age of Instagram and social media. Athletes promote themselves and often advertise brands they are associated with on these platforms, and they want to look good doing it, which is fair enough. But the problem comes with their needs to aesthetically look good versus their needs to perform at the highest level. Finally, as someone who's coached in both male and female sports, the micronutrient needs differ between genders, and as coaches we need to ensure that this aspect is not disregarded for both health and performance reasons. Like most of my guests, Kate is active on LinkedIn under her name Kate Pumpa. Again, if you've enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to your colleagues, and in the meantime keep learning, and catch you next time on the Coach Doctor podcast.